Off Edwin C. Moses Boulevard, there is a memorial honoring local citizens who fought and died in World War II. Perhaps it's been a while since you stopped there to reflect on the sacrifices made during that horrible conflict. Perhaps you've never been there at all. But it would serve us well to remember a time when all Daytonians endured the worst so that we might enjoy the best today. And to realize that the entire city of Dayton is a living testament to what they accomplished. The early years of the 1940s were a time of impending danger and national unity, a time of personal sacrifice and civic duty, a time when this community came together to help defend freedom here and around the world. When the United States entered the war in 1941, citizens from around the Miami Valley joined the armed forces and went overseas to fight a distant enemy. Those who stayed behind engaged in a prolonged, selfless battle of their own, determined to support the soldiers who were in harm's way. Their battles would be both large and small, from meeting the needs of an expanding military workforce to the secret development of a decoder that would help shorten the war. Now, new generations face the challenges of an uncertain world, and we find ourselves looking again to events that are almost 7 decades past, looking for answers and inspiration. This program is a small picture of what Dayton and the Miami Valley were like during the years of 1941 through 1945. And it's offered as a tribute to those who lived and worked in what would come to be known as the home front. The story of that generation is really our story. And those who remain give witness to who we were and who we can become when our freedom is under attack.
Wilbur and I believed that the first use to which the airplane would be put would be for military purposes, and by employing it, war would be so terrible that there would be no more wars. Orville Wright.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Someone said over the radio, "Did you hear that Pearl Harbor was bombed?" Well, we didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. That was the first that I heard of it. Everyone was horrified, really insulted.
I was coming home in the evening, and I had the radio on in the car, and they came on and said Pearl Harbor had been bombed. That was new to us. We hadn't any idea anybody would bomb anything in the United States. I visualized California being invaded by troops and everything else, and that kind of upset me a little bit.
We were home with the radio on, because that's where you got your news in those days. You can't express the feeling. You were numb from the announcement.
And we heard the news, and then we came out and started talking to neighbors, and they were all quite shocked, as we were, and sort of didn't know what to do or what was going to happen.
And I couldn't believe it. My first impressions were that I should dash out the front door and see what I could do to help.
It was a defining moment. Our naval bases at Pearl Harbor attacked by Japan without warning on a Sunday morning. It was an affront to both God and country. And our reactions were many, a raw mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. It didn't matter who you were or what your politics were. There would be no avoiding the chain of events begun that day. Everyone was going to war.
I remember a poster in the kitchen of my parents and my aunts and uncles' kitchens, giving directions for what you do in an air raid. And they were a little scary to think that there might be airplanes coming across that were going to do us harm.
All of the windows in the house were taped over with dry cleaning bags from the Waltz Dry Cleaning Company, black paper bags, so that there would be no light at night, so the enemy couldn't see us if they flew over.
In the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, a general state of emergency was declared throughout the area. It wasn't an act of panic. The Miami Valley was home to Wright and Patterson airfields, two of the most significant continental bases in the United States Air Force.
Wright Field was responsible for experimentation. Patterson Field started actually having a dock built that they would repair airplanes at that would be flown back and repaired here. Well, the first thing they did is lock down the fields, as you can imagine. They were sort of on an alert to begin with, but it was really much more after that.
As a matter of precaution, aerial and ground defenses were established around the bases. Private planes were grounded, and local manufacturing plants that were already producing material for the Air Force were given protection as well. Wright Field would soon become the wartime center of aeronautical research, development, and procurement, while Patterson Field would serve as a major logistics center and Midwest supply hub for the military.
Having the air base here that we have, we've always been led to believe that we were a target. We had rumors of war around. It was so far away, and you couldn't imagine it striking home.
In the city, the Dayton Council for Defense began making preparations in earnest. Air raid shelters opened in the basement of the old Stickle Brewery on South Warren Street, and the Masonic Temple was readied as an emergency hospital. Officials also authorized the installation of air raid sirens around the city.
So they decided to test one, and the one that they tested was so bad that only 7 people from out the entire city called to say, "What was that noise?" So they ended up buying these really huge ones. They were supposed to be loud enough to burst your eardrums. Well, they didn't have the money at first to put them on towers. So they were actually in people's backyards.
The changes that occurred in Dayton in those early days of the war were profound, yet eerily subtle. Yes, there was a war raging over in Europe and in the Pacific, but daily lives here seemed strangely unaffected at first. Residents still awoke each day and went to work. Students still had to go to school and do their homework. There were still chores to be done and families to care for. It was as if life could almost go on as it had before. In the days before Dayton went to war, city residents had been increasingly upbeat and hopeful. The effects of a decade-long depression were receding by the late 1930s. Many local companies had returned to 5-day work weeks after years of cost-cutting. And it was time to enjoy the renewed sense of confidence in the city's economy. Reich's department store downtown expanded, and shoppers could ride there in one of the city's new electric buses. Workers of the National Cash Register Company could enjoy memorable visits to the company's Old River Park. But even in this prosperity were ominous signs of what was to come. For the recovery that Daytonians were enjoying was, in part, fueled by the production of war materials for allies, already engaged in a growing conflict overseas, a conflict that many local citizens hoped to avoid. But after Pearl Harbor, there could be no avoidance. Americans, too, were called to battle. It was a call that everyone would answer. In 1940, the United States instituted the first peacetime draft in its history. But following Franklin D. Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan, there was no shortage of volunteers.
I had 3 brothers, all of whom were in the service. My oldest brother, Jerry, had been drafted. My brother, John, joined the Navy rather than being drafted. And then my brother Rich, the youngest, he also joined the Navy.
I was a teenager at the time. I was like most teenagers. You never thought about death at all. You thought, well, this is going to be some kind of adventure, but you better be careful.
Uncle Sam Wants You became a familiar refrain of the day. Answering the call came recruits from all walks of life, determined to do their part. Charles Thomas, then a teacher in the Springfield school system, was typical in his resolve to serve.
I passed everything medical except the eye exam. While I was sitting there, I thought, well, I'll just memorize the chart. So I memorized the first 2 lines of the eye chart. I came home, told everybody what was going on, and from there I went over to Columbus. And the post office there had a Navy recruiting. I passed everything. The eye exam, fortunately, they were using the same card. So I did AELTY-PHT was the combination of the letters. And so I was able to pass it, and I was commissioned an ensign in the Navy.
Donald Mauck was only 18 when he received his draft notice. Having never left home before, his introduction into the military was initially overwhelming.
I know Mom and Dad and I and the kids all went, my brothers and sisters, most of them went down to the Union Station. There was about 20 of us that was leaving. There was 4 or 5 from our class, of high school class. I know we stood out in the Union Station yard there for a long time, waiting for the train to come in after they had all their ceremonies and everything else. They gave you a little prayer book and a little teeny American flag that you were to carry with you while you were in the service, stuff like that. But you still stood there half paralyzed, like, but where are we going? What are we doing?
Don's older sister, Helen, remembers well her concern as her younger brother left for the war.
Oh, my goodness. He's only 18 years old. How's he going to do this? And what is it going to mean? Because I was 22 myself, and I was working, but he was just out of high school.
Saying goodbye to loved ones became a familiar scene in Dayton. At those moments, a strong sense of pride and duty was tempered by the uncertainty that lay ahead. It was a world war they were going to fight. But in doing so, many fathers, sons, and husbands were saying goodbye to the only world they had ever known. While the armed forces mobilized for Europe and the Pacific, a third front was readied back home. The country's expanding war machine would require transportation as well as weapons and munitions. It would be up to the home front to keep the military well supplied. With a large industrial base already established here, Dayton was well suited for this duty. Area factories were quickly retooled.
We were known as the city of 1,000 factories, and we were building bomb sites, machine guns, proximity fuses, propellers. You had big things like NCR and Frigidaire and GM building tanks and parts for tanks and airplanes.
By 1943, there would be over 60 principal war production industries busy in the Dayton area. Companies that only months before were turning out cash registers, refrigerators, and car parts were now making carburetors for B-29 bombers, machine guns, and bomb casings. 48-hour work weeks became commonplace, and factories maintained 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, to keep up with the endless demand.
I worked a lot of hours. We'd go in the morning, maybe 7 o'clock, and maybe sometimes it'd be midnight before we leave. I worked 60-some straight days without a day off. I mean, I had friends that were over there in the battle lines, and you thought about that. I mean, you were supporting them, more or less, and I never thought anything about working all those hours.
The demand for war production labor greatly strained Dayton's workforce, whose ranks were already depleted by men leaving for military service. In early 1942, projections showed that an additional 56,000 factory workers were needed to meet the orders that were coming in. less than half that number could be filled by new workers coming into Dayton, so other sources of labor needed to be found. The Dayton War Manpower Committee discussed ways to better utilize the existing workforce and how to get more residents to enter the workforce. Employers with more than 8 people were encouraged to redirect non-essential workers into factory positions. And local retailers signed pledges to keep staff sizes trimmed back to 1940 levels. Meanwhile, factory doors, which had previously been all but closed to some, suddenly opened wide. With necessity came the willingness to look past stereotypes to recognize useful skills. A handicap was no longer the insurmountable barrier it had once seemed to be, and racial prejudice was no longer enough reason to discriminate on the shop floor.
They had this tremendous industrial buildup, and they needed manpower, so the racial issues kind of went by the boards. And that was an opportunity. It was an opportunity for African Americans in the sense that, hey, at last we get a chance to participate, and for some of those whites who had looked askance at us could say, hey, they can do it.
Increased opportunity for minorities and the physically handicapped was a significant advancement for Dayton. But what really got people's attention was the large number of women that began entering the workforce, many for the first time.
Well, of course, we had to hire some women. Now, this was interesting because we'd never had any women working in the shop before, but I think they hired about 12. And some of the guys used to come in early just to watch the girls go back into their department.
When I worked at Premier Rubber Company, I was a secretary. And when the boys from down in the shipping department were drafted, I went down and took over shipping department. So it changed my job too. I wasn't just a secretary. And of course, before that, no women had gotten down at the shipping department. There was just all men down there. So things changed from that standpoint too.
My mother, who had been a minister's wife all of her life, she had never worked in a business capacity in her life. But when this happened and her boys were gone, she went out here to NCR and applied, and they gave her a job as a receptionist.
Since many women had never had an outside job before, a systematic recruitment campaign was employed to raise awareness of their potential value to the war effort. A door-to-door survey was conducted to gauge interest and to identify any personal concerns. One important result was the recognition that more daycare facilities were needed to free up many women for work. Billboards were placed around the city, and newspaper advertisements touted the importance of women to the war effort. A brochure called The War Worker was heavily circulated in public areas. The brochure kept the public constantly aware of available production jobs. And since these were the days before television, a series of short films called Dayton Women March to War were produced for local theaters.
Dayton women are marching to war. Women are driving the buses that carry war workers to their jobs. Women are doing their part in keeping wartime Dayton supplied with clean laundry. Women are preparing and serving the food for the hungry war workers. Yes, in every essential wartime activity, in the factories and at the airfields, Dayton women are helping to keep the wheels of industry turning. And hundreds of these women have never worked before at such jobs. But the War Manpower Commission says at least 12,000 more Dayton women are needed to fill the shoes of the men who have gone to war.
Radio stations like WHIO conducted interviews with female employees right inside the factory. It was hoped that publicity like this would help break down the attitude that a woman's place was in the home.
The Dayton radio stations took their mics to the assembly lines and interviewed the women, young and old, who were fighting on the production battlefields of America.
Tell me, Mrs. Bradley, how do you like working in a factory?
Well, right now, there isn't anything I'd like better.
How does your husband feel about it?
He feels fine about it. Every evening when I come home, I get an extra kiss.
The effort to have women fill vacant wartime positions was a resounding success. By 1943, a survey revealed that 30% of Dayton's industrial workforce was female, a 150% increase from 1940. A genie had been let out of her bottle, never to return. And all across the country, Rosie the Riveter was celebrated for her invaluable contributions. As the war continued, it would take all that and more to help stay the course. There's an old adage that cautions us to be careful what we wish for, because it might just come true. In 1942, Dayton needed an expanded workforce for its war production, and got it. By the end of 1943, Dayton's industries had expanded to some 115,000 people. Many of these workers were new to the area. Others were commuters flowing in and out of the city each day. Long lines were commonplace, and the crowds, well, they just seemed to be everywhere.
Factories were working 3 shifts, and people poured into Dayton, which created a shortage of everything. You couldn't even rent a garage, let alone a place to live. And no matter when you were out, there were people, wall-to-wall people.
Public transportation soon proved inadequate for the massive shifts of war workers moving back and forth from the factories. In response, the city acquired new, larger buses to handle the increased demand.
All of a sudden, they started putting up these railings around like they do at Disney World to make sure you don't all crowd in at the beginning of the line. And we started going round and round these railings to get to the bus. And then one day we got to the bus, and it was a big semi-truck.
They were like a big wooden bus. And I don't mean metal, I mean wooden bus. It was gigantic. At the time, it seemed to me like about 1.5 times the size of a regular bus. It cost 15 cents, and if you were lucky enough to get on this bus and get a seat, you sat on this bench all the way out there. It was terrible. Or you stood up and hung from straps from the ceiling.
They had a coal stove, and they would be heating the back of the truck so that we wouldn't be too cold. And that's the way they drove us back and forth to Fairborn part of the time during that period, getting a lot of the people to work because it was so many people.
Adding to the strain on public transit were residents who found it increasingly difficult to drive their own cars. The production of new automobiles had been stopped, and rubber was one of the first items to be rationed during the war. Owners were informed that they would have to make their cars and their tires last as long as possible.
You couldn't buy a tire anywhere, but I did see an ad in the paper for a fellow that had a tire that I could use on my 36 Ford. I lived in North Dayton, went all the way over to the west side to pick up a tire, paid him his $2, and brought it back home. It was a used tire, but there's probably a couple 100 miles left on it.
With new tires at a premium, old tires were pushed to their limits, and then some. As a matter of public safety, a tire inspection program was begun in 1942. Each tire was individually numbered and tracked, and car owners were expected to keep inspection records in their cars at all times. Gasoline was also rationed, which all but eliminated casual driving of any kind. To purchase gas, drivers had to register for a monthly allotment. Each vehicle was given a rating, which indicated its priority for receiving fuel, based on how it was used. A letter placed on the car's windshield signified its rating. And how much gas did a non-essential car get? About 16 gallons a month. Since cars couldn't be replaced, proper maintenance was essential during the war. The only problem was that service had to be scheduled months in advance due to the overwhelming demand. In fact, there was an overwhelming demand for virtually everything in Dayton, especially when it came to housing.
The housing shortage was fierce, and people would turn their attics into housing quarters, and they doubled up in bedrooms and everything. And so if you were extremely lucky, you could get good housing, but it wasn't easy because everyone was utilizing every space that they had.
Well, it affected us greatly because at that time we were renting, and they sold the house that we were living in, and we had to be out in 30 days. 30 days, and you couldn't find a sleeping room.
Unlike traditional urban growth, which often took decades to occur, Dayton's population exploded in only a year's time. It was an extraordinary circumstance, one which called for an extraordinary response. The Dayton Housing Authority promoted several new residential developments to help alleviate the congestion. But there was a concern that additional housing would go unused after the war. Keeping this in mind, some construction projects like Parkside Homes on Kiowee Street were built for long-term use, while others, like the Riverbend project on Herman Avenue and a trailer camp at Old McCook Field, were expected to last just long enough to provide desperately needed space. In most cases, the housing units themselves were small, yet adequate. It was frustrating at times, but there wasn't any point in complaining. Everyone was in the same boat. Never was this more evident than when a national program of food rationing was introduced. As goods were diverted to the military, they became scarcer back home. Rationing was begun to prevent wide-scale price increases and inflation. The list of rationed goods was extensive: sugar, coffee, meat, and a variety of processed foods, vegetables, fruits. What people ate and when they ate it was no longer simply a matter of personal choice. Coffee drinkers over the age of 15 were limited to 1 pound every 5 weeks, while citizens over the age of 12 were restricted to just 2.5 pounds of meat a week.
I can remember that more than anything else. I used to go up to the meat market on the corner, and it would be packed. Apparently he only got meat in every so often, and we used to have, that's how we got our meat, with the ration stamps.
Every adult and child in the country would be issued a ration book each year of the war. The books contained stamps or points representing their fair share of the food supply. Rationing itself worked on a point system. Each item for sale essentially had 2 prices, one in dollars and another in points. A customer had to have both to make a purchase. Once a sale was made, the retailer could then use the points he collected to buy more food for resale. Displayed at every store was a list of more than 200 point values set by the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. There was one set of points for meat, fish, and dairy products, and another for fruits and vegetables. Oh yes, sugar and coffee were sold using a separate set of ration coupons. Does that sound confusing? Confusing or not, rationing was serious business. There were severe penalties for fraud, and if a person died, grieving families were required by law to return their ration book to the rationing board. Even selling and trading ration stamps was illegal, but that didn't stop an honest deal every now and then.
People bartered a lot. You didn't talk about this, but this is what happened. And I know my mother was acquainted with our bread man. At that time, bread man came around through the country to bring your bread and your fancy rolls or whatever. And we had plenty of meat, but we didn't have shoes. So Mother would trade him meat stamps for shoe stamps. And I know my sister, she was a drum major at the time, and she didn't have stamps to get her drum major shoes. And I think a lady or a man that used to come to our farm to get chickens and eggs gave us
or traded us some stamps so she could get her drum major boots.
Doing with little and doing without became a way of life for people in the Miami Valley. When the military needed more raw materials, the soldiers on the home front organized salvage drives of every kind. Discarded tin could be used to ship food overseas and in the construction of airplanes. Cooking fat provided glycerin, a basic ingredient for making gunpowder. Rubber was so badly needed that even the making of rubber bands and erasers was outlawed. Scrap metal was so valuable that a suggestion was made to remove the iron doors from the old courthouse at 3rd and Main, but they survived. Collecting bits of scrap metal and cooking grease didn't make for a glamorous life, but it did have its lighter side.
And there was an announcer from Dayton named Bud Baldwin, and he was really a humorous fellow, and he used to say, "Okay, ladies, get your fat cans out on the curb." And everyone thought that was funny, but they got their fat cans out on the curb.
Even people's appearances changed with the times. In 1942, the War Production Board eliminated vests, patch pockets, and cuffs from men's clothing in an effort to conserve millions of pounds of wool.
I had bought a new suit, and when I went to pick it up after it was altered, there were no cuff on the pants. Now that was terrible. Because that was unheard of, no cuff on a pair of pants. But after a while, I got used to it.
Women's wardrobes changed as well. Skirts were limited in width and length, and the manufacture of silk and nylon hosiery was stopped altogether. Joanne Sauer remembers that it was possible to have nylons repaired at Reich's department store for only 35 cents. And in summertime, a girl had other options as well.
So in the summertime, young girls, which I was then, we wore leg makeup all the time. Of course, when you sat down, the inside of your skirt had makeup on it and everything. You didn't dare get caught in the rain or your legs ran clear down into your shoes. But those were some of the sacrifices.
Large sacrifices and small inconveniences. These were the constant battles of the home front. Yet they were a small price to pay to support the troops who risked their lives every day. But for all the problems, there was an energy in the city. And in many cases, crowded neighbors became fast friends. People worked hard. And when they had some moments to spare, they played hard as well. Yet all the while, there was a sense that important things were being accomplished. The general morale of war workers was greatly improved when employers helped address their unique problems. For workers unable to find time to take care of personal business, such services were offered right at the factory. And local retailers began extending store hours so that all workers had a chance to shop for basic necessities. In 1943, the Department of War celebrated this initiative in a film entitled A Community at War.
Yes, this is now Dayton on a Monday night or a Wednesday night. A one-shift town adjusting itself to a three-shift tempo. The retail stores are open. The 5 and 10 is open. The markets are open. The department stores are open. Retailers are able to hire high school girls working part-time as sales ladies, thus finding it easier to go back to their 1940 employment levels. With no inconvenience to the stores, essential shopping needs of the community are being met.
But even as Daytonians made the best of a difficult situation, events overseas were never far from their minds. If Pearl Harbor had been a wake-up call, then subsequent defeats early in the war were an affirmation that the struggle could be long and hard.
You know, we were really afraid for a while that we weren't going to win the war. We were really frightened.
It was just a time that you just survived, and you each day you were hoping the war would be over. I had a feeling at one point I thought this war will never end.
Daytonians were constantly reminded of how tenuous freedom could be should the war be lost, and that much of what happened in the Miami Valley had a direct impact on battlefields across the world. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe finally began on the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious assault in the history of the world. What followed would be some of the most intense fighting of the war. Back on the home front, it would be a test of patience and faith. For families with soldiers in the line of fire, the war was intensely personal, a matter of flesh and blood. In their windows were placed blue stars, one for every child in the military. It was the greatest sacrifice a mother could make.
And Grandma had several stars on hers, and I never saw anybody else that had as many as my grandma had. And we were proud of that, and Grandma was proud of that. She was born in Italy, but she let her sons go to war. She's an American, you know.
Blue stars were hung with pride. But inside those homes, behind those windows, was a nagging sense of vulnerability.
I'm sure that it bothered them a great deal, particularly Mother. I recall the doctor telling her if she did not stop worrying, she was going to have a breakdown. And so Mother turned to prayer, and every day when I came home from school, she'd be sitting on the Davenports praying for them.
Blue Star mothers, as they came to be called, lived daily with uncertainty, never knowing when a telegram might arrive. Their greatest fear, that their blue star would turn to gold.
People would watch for, unfortunately, if there was a gold star in the window, it meant that the person had passed away. And that was always sad to see, a star in a window. It just was one of the terrible things that went with it.
There was a lot of concern for other people. You know, everybody knew somebody who had somebody in the service, and people, you know, made sure that they didn't need anything.
For African American mothers, the pain was especially difficult. Dayton in the 1940s was, like the rest of the country, divided. As citizens, the war years were a time of unity and common purpose. But even then, there were barriers that kept white and black apart.
My grandmother sent me to the grocery store with our coupons because we needed 5 pieces of meat. And we had to get it all at the same time because you stand in line to get your food, and people could be shoving and pushing. It was a rat race, believe me. And then this grocer was waiting on me, and he did not pick the very best pieces. They're fat and just not the very best. And he looked at me and said, "This is good enough for you."
Living with prejudice was an everyday reality for African Americans, who still awaited the equality this country promised. Yet when war came, many black residents felt that they too belonged in the fight.
The feeling that I had, and most of my friends had, was that this is something that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to participate whether we want to or not, and so we'll just do the best we can. And we realized that notwithstanding the fact that we were not full citizens, that this was our country, and we weren't too sure about what the consequences would be if the others won. So we figured, well, we better get in there and do the best we can. Even though things aren't all perfect for us, we don't know what it would be otherwise.
Black soldiers left a segregated society, only to enter a segregated military as well. It was a reminder that they were defending a freedom that they didn't fully share themselves, a sometimes painful irony.
In spite of the fact that we've had indignities, this is our country. I would not want to be anyplace else. However, I felt that to have men going into the service and not be good enough to be in the same barracks with whites, to ride on the same troop ships with whites, any of that. It was all so segregated, and to me that seemed wrong.
Unfortunately, with death came the ultimate sense of unity. For the loss of a child, white or black, left an indelible mark across the hearts of all mothers. And their loss reverberated throughout the community. For the loss of a son was the loss of a neighbor, a classmate, a co-worker, a friend. Long before cell phones and email, letters were the fragile connection between the home front and the war front. To families and friends, a letter was a welcome sign that a loved one was still alive. For the soldiers, it was a chance to catch up on news from home.
I thought it was important because, after all, that's all those boys had. You know, they were in mud, and it was a war. It was, you fought for your life every day. They were away from home and away from those people that they loved.
Well, I got letters from my mother, mostly, and from my grandmother. My grandmother was an elderly lady who didn't have a chance to get a whole lot of formal education, but she read the newspaper every day. And she would write to me. Some of the letters were, some of the words were slightly misspelled, but she was sincere, and I knew that if anybody in this world loved me, it was her and my mother.
We were never really at a place where we could get much mail, but when it did come, even though it was like 3 months old, it was still just the most wonderful thrill that you could possibly have. It made people live close to you.
During the course of the war, a letter from home may have been the most important weapon in America's arsenal. For the troops, it was a connection to the life they once knew and hoped to see again.
Mildred, my wife, she sent cookies. She put them in a container, and then a layer of popcorn, and she put the cookies over that, then another layer of popcorn to keep the cookies from breaking. And of course, they got through perfectly. But people all over were doing things like that.
My sister and I did try to cheer up some of the soldiers. It had snowed, and my sister and I went out to have our pictures taken. The ones of just Eileen and I together we sent to our boy friends. And my father came out with us, and so we had my dad in between us and sent those pictures to all of our relatives.
Dad would get Donald Duck orange juice, and you know, the standard juice size can. And Dad would take that soldering gun, and he'd get a hole in it big enough to where the orange juice would dribble out. We'd dribble out all the orange juice, and us kids would have orange juice and popcorn. And he would go about unsoldering the rest of the top of the can, take the top of the can off, and put a fifth of whiskey in the can. Pack it full of popcorn, solder the lid very carefully back on, put the label back on, and put it in these boxes that you could send to your servicemen.
A message from home provided relief from the misery of combat. But it wasn't always easy for a soldier, reading about the people they loved and the things they were missing.
Dad wrote about the fact that I was away for 2 years now, and it was the third one he's going to have to set the table without us, without me there. And it was already, the table would be set, Mom had the turkey and everything, and I got a drink sitting in front of your place, waiting for you. That was basically, I mean, those are the kind of things that made it worse, actually, than better. Yet you knew, if you were there reading it, you knew, well, I'll be there next year. And that was what you had to live off of.
Back on the home front, the pain of separation was equally great. But here, there were opportunities to do something about it. If a husband or son were overseas, Lending a hand at the local USO could be therapeutic. There, soldiers were provided food and a place to rest as they traveled through Dayton. Volunteering for the Red Cross was also popular because it provided aid and comfort for the troops overseas.
I remember my mother volunteering at the Red Cross, and then she even invited me down there at one point to do some work. The big thing in those days was stuffing small cardboard boxes with cookies and toothbrushes and toothpaste, and I can't think what all. There were a lot of little things. Maybe it was a sewing kit. I just can't remember the small things. I remember we packed an awful lot of those boxes, though. An awful lot, for the guys overseas, obviously.
Many war workers were so busy working 2 jobs that they didn't have time to volunteer. Still, they and many others were able to contribute more by purchasing war bonds. Local companies like NCR enthusiastically encouraged their employees to invest 10% of their wages in bonds. NCR also spearheaded a national initiative to ask retail customers to accept part of their change in war stamps. In 1944, the USS Dayton, a light Navy cruiser, was commissioned. The ship was entirely financed by bond sales in the Dayton area. In all, area residents would purchase over $314 million worth of bonds. Like the savings bonds of today, war bonds promised a comfortable return on investment. But for many, the only return that would matter would be the one that began with the words, "Welcome home." In 1943, the Memphis Belle, the B-17 Flying Fortress, made a stopover in Dayton. The Belle's crew was celebrated as the first to survive 25 combat missions in Europe. While visiting with NCR employees, the pilot, Captain Robert Morgan, thanked Dayton's workers for their continued support of the war.
Teammates, after all, that's what we all are. We're teammates of the greatest team that's ever been formed in the world. And you're just as important part of that team as we are. Don't ever forget that.
It was a big morale booster. The newspapers carried it, and people talked about how much they loved seeing these young men who were heroes in their eyes, and thinking that Dayton was important enough for them to show up, because, only so many cities got to see these guys.
For outstanding efforts in war production, numerous Dayton factories would receive the Army-Navy E Award during the course of the war. NCR and Frigidaire would each receive the coveted banner a record 5 times. But perhaps the most consequential work being done in Dayton would not even be acknowledged for many decades. And it all had to do with a brilliant engineer from NCR named Joseph Desch, and an unlikely workforce comprised largely of waves from the Navy. Desch's work at NCR had led to the creation of vacuum tubes, which allowed for extremely fast computations in calculators of the day. The Navy enlisted Desch to develop a decoding device to break Germany's Enigma code used by Nazi submarines. Due to the shortage of manpower and the need for secrecy, the Navy sent waves to assist in the construction of the decoder, known as a bomb. At NCR's Building 26, Desch, the waves, and a group of NCR employees set about this important task in 1943.
Well, we never knew at the time what we were doing. It was very secretive. But I was loaned to them as more or less a model maker. My experience as building machinery and so forth, in which frequently the engineers would come out with a sketch of a part or something like that and say, make me 5, make me 6 of these. They were experimenting on different things.
So secret was the bomb project that neither the Waves nor the NCR employees were told what they were working on. Each worker was given a specific task to accomplish, and no more.
We worked in a one room all the time. We're not allowed to go in any other room unless our name was on the door. We didn't go in that room. We had Marines that guarded the building, and when we went into work, they had to recognize us before we could get in the building. We knew it was important because we were not allowed to talk about it. We didn't discuss our work while we were working or when we were away from work. Never.
Each day, the Waves marched through the streets of Dayton as they went to work. Of course, there were a few residents who wondered what the Navy was doing so far from the sea.
We would see the Waves marching from Sugar Camp in formation, marching from Sugar Camp down to the NCR plants. Well, we didn't know what they were doing down there, what was their job, and even the civilians didn't know what they were doing because it wasn't told.
While working on the bomb, the Waves lived at Sugar Camp, a retreat built by NCR that overlooked Dayton. A visitor to the camp might have gotten the impression that the Waves were getting a little rest and relaxation. In fact, they were working around the clock.
We worked shifts. We worked the days 1 week, next week we worked evenings, and the next week we worked nights. So we learned to sleep all hours of the day.
When the decoders were finished, they were sent back to Washington, along with some of the Waves who learned to operate them. Nesh's work proved successful and is believed responsible for shortening the war with Germany by as much as 2 years. Nesh's high-speed calculators also played a role in the development of the atomic bomb, which would soon bring the war with Japan to a close. On May 7, 1945, German forces unconditionally surrendered. 3 months later, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Japan would surrender 8 days later. The war was over. A victory that Daytonians had worked so hard to achieve was finally here.
I come home from school, and the flag is flying. His flag is hung from the porch. And there's my mother jumping up and down on the porch, and she's yelling, "The war is over! The war is over!"
I was downtown at walking along 3rd and Main Street, and everybody was so excited. And when I found out the war is over, and strangers, complete strangers, walking up to each other, hugging and kissing each other because the war was over. And one young man came up and kissed me. Of course, I was a freshman at the time, and I thought that was wonderful.
Well, it was bedlam. It was people from one side of the street to the other, everybody happy. Everybody, they congregated downtown, on the downtown streets, wall-to-wall people. Everybody, happy and that it was over.
With the end of the war came relief from the things that had come to define life on the home front. No more rationing, no more salvage drives, no more fear of the unknown. As the soldiers began returning home, Dayton's industrial might could once again be turned to the manufacture of peacetime materials. It was as if life could almost go on as it had before. But things were different now. Some soldiers didn't return, and those that did brought back experiences that would stay with them for a lifetime. And there were lessons learned right here in Dayton, lessons that helped define a generation, lessons that still speak to us today.
Well, the whole world should have learned it's just a big waste, really. I mean, the war is just a complete waste.
Well, that was the war to end all wars, and I wish it had. There's still going to be something going on. We're at war now, but it's different.
I think we learned that you have to dig in and do what you have to do when you have to do it, and which we all did back then. And I worry sometimes that our young people today, I don't know that they could handle what we did, because we lived through a depression first. And I think that showed us how important it was to do everything possible during that war effort, because everybody cooperated in some way or another.
But the saddest thing to me is that it doesn't last. You know, we do these things, we fight these wars, we're very cohesive, and then once it's over, we begin to go back into some of our divisive kinds of attitudes.
In a VE Day speech, Mayor Frank Krebs lauded Dayton's Army behind the Army. It is with pride that I, as mayor of Dayton, can point to our part in the war effort, he said. And from the bottom of my heart, I wish to pay tribute to the fighters on the home front, as well as to those who have brought honor and fame to Dayton by their achievements on all fighting fronts.
The greatest lessons that we learned were to accept that we have to do and do it well. You know, there's nothing that we can't do if you make up your mind. And I think we should have learned then, or learned now from then, that there's nothing impossible in today's world.